You're listening to 9 Plus, a research podcast from Waterford Institute of Technology. Today in the podcast, we're discussing spirituality. I'm speaking with Bernadette Flanagan and Paul Clogher of the SpirSoP research group. We talked about the differences and connections between spirituality, religion and theology. We also talked about applied spirituality, specifically in the area of tourism and even technology. And finally, we had a chat about the cinema of contemplation, reflecting on a recent publication about the Paul Schrader film, First Reformed. If you like what you hear, please consider leaving us a positive review on your podcasting app of choice. And if you want to check us out on Twitter, we're at 9 Plus Podcast. That's digit 9 PLUS Podcast. Okay, as always, I began the conversation by asking my guests to introduce themselves.
My name is Bernadette Flanagan and I work in different aspects of spirituality studies in WIT. Mostly I work with students that are undertaking research in spirituality, either at MA or PhD level.
My name is Paul Clogher. I lecture in theology and religious studies, and I also am a co-director of the spirituality research group, and I also work as a supervisor on the MA in spirituality.
Okay, so this is on 9 Plus Podcast so far. We've talked to people from a wide variety of disciplines, science, humanities, technology, engineering. And now we're going into an area that I really feel out of my depth. So if I ask you any silly questions, I apologise in advance. I'm trying to learn. So here you go. Okay. So I'm going to start off with a really basic question, or what I think is probably a very basic question, but I don't know the answer or I'm unclear. What is the difference between spirituality and religion? Bernadette, I might give that to you.
Okay, well, that's a complicated question, but let's say some spirituality has come from religion, in that, you know, religious traditions have developed not just rules and regulations and moral codes, but they've also developed practices, particularly meditation practices, awareness, enlightenment practices, all of those kind of areas. So they're the kind of element of religion that spirituality is particularly focused on. How to be able to live in a more alert and aware way, which is a specialism that the religious traditions have in terms of their meditation, contemplation practice. But there's more to spirituality than just practices. Spirituality also is interested in areas like, say, science. And the biology behind these meditation practices. So if you are in a Buddhist monastery or a Christian monastery, you mightn't have to study the science of meditation, whereas in spirituality you're going to get involved in the biology behind the meditation as well. So there's something extra in spirituality, and of course there's something extra in religion as well, that we wouldn't be looking at doctrines and beliefs in spirituality.
Paul, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think there's a good analogy in if you think, for example, in classical Greek, not to get too academic about it, but the word pneuma or pneuma was often used to or translated as spirit in English, and the basic idea of pneuma or pneuma was that it was something that animated the human body. And you could say that what spirituality is, in the broadest sense, is that which those elements in life that animate us, and it kind of it encompasses aspects of what we classically know as religion, but it's also much more than that. So you can see horizons evolving, say in the world of business, in other aspects of life where people perhaps are moving away from more institutionalized ways of engaging with spirituality and with spiritual ideas, and when we talk about spirituality, we're talking more about, I suppose, what animates. Some of that comes from the traditions of associated with religion, but equally they look toward broader horizons as well. So
I'm going to say something back to you, and you can correct me or agree with me or put me in my place. So would it be fair to say spirituality is a sense of something outside of yourself that informs something inside of you? Is that no? That's what I'm not saying that correctly. It's something outside a study of something outside of you, or a sense of something that's outside of yourself, but that it impacts on yourself, but it is maybe not necessarily self-generated. Is that?
Yeah, I think.
You're probably now going, what is this fool
Bernadette,
talking about?
I would think, well, I don't know if it has to come from outside yourself, but there is, suddenly you awaken to this kind of inspiration or energy, or the challenge is the language. Well, you awaken to something in yourself. I love talking to musicians and poets, people in the arts. It's this experience of inspiration. That they don't know where the words for the song, they don't know where the idea behind the poetry came, but something awakened within them. Now, whether that's a sense of a spiritual force impacting on them and awakening this idea, or whether it's something that arises deep within their own consciousness, people express that differently, probably. But it is that sense of a way of coming to an aliveness in yourself, similar to what Paul is saying. That is something different to your everyday experience of reality. So that's definitely the world that we're in when we're in spirituality.
So spirituality is not religion, but it has overlaps with religion. Would that be fair?
Yes, I would think so.
Okay, right. Now, Paul, I'm going to ask you this as well, just because I don't know, and I want to get the vocabulary out in my head. What's the difference between religion and theology?
The best way to explain it perhaps would be that religion is the phenomena of organised beliefs and practices that we might associate with movements such as Christianity, Judaism, Islam, what we call the classical world religions. Theology is more like it's the classical definition, or the basic definition of it is theo, and logos simply means God talk, or talk about God. So theology is what I would think of as the critical exploration of ideas that might inform and shape the religious traditions, or ideas about God, the divine, ultimate meaning. But it is not necessarily the expression of one particular religious tradition, or the official version, if that would be, if that's the best way to think about it, of a particular religious tradition. It's the act of, or the process of, thinking critically about what those ideas mean. Theologians would often interrogate concepts of God, but also how they reflect, aspects of our human identity and our place in the world. Theologians think about the meaning and the meanings that people bring to life and the practice of life, but they think of them critically and in a variety of spaces. And of course, it's informed by traditions and ideas and shapes about the world. But I suppose theology in relation to religion and in relation to spirituality as well, because they connect into one another. Theology is the critical, I suppose, interrogation of religious ideas. Spirituality might be the critical reflection on the praxis, or the practice of those ideas, but more than that, the practice of life itself, not necessarily connected with institutional religion or a particular theology, but often referencing it. So they're like Venn diagrams that hit off each other at various points, and they inform each other, but they're also, I think, as we kind of go with the journey into the way we explore these ideas, particularly in the academy. I always say to students at the beginning of an academic year, you're studying, religious studies at WIT, for example, in an undergraduate setting, and I always say, well, there isn't a crucifix on the wall, and WIT isn't a particularly holy place in one sense. So what does it mean then to explore these ideas in this context? And it's not just about being critical and detached, it's also about interrogating your own understandings and your own assumptions about these ideas, and also exploring them in new contexts as well. So like when Bernadette mentioned there, the way the arts work, and the way the arts kind of, they defy function. It's more a process of creativity, of inspiration, and philosophers and indeed sociologists have often commented how the arts kind of take us to the borderline of what maybe religious experience, or how religious experience has been talked about or explored in the past, but that they do so on their own terms and through their own wave of creativity and in their own integrity. And so in a sense, when we're exploring all of these ideas like religion and theology and spirituality, which both connect and interconnect in different ways, I think sometimes the artistic metaphor is often a good way to explain it, because in a way, exploring these ideas in the context that we work in is a bit like the way that we have to give an artistic experience or a musical experience its own integrity, its own setting, its own place, and not impose ideas upon it, but actually allow meaning, if you will, to emerge from it.
Okay, so I think I'm a little bit wiser from that, and the Venn, maybe it's just because I'm in computing and maths myself. The Venn diagram, I'm imagining three circles in a Venn diagram of spirituality, religion and theology. There's a very small intersection point between them that is perhaps a biblical scholar or a Buddhist theologian or something like that. I'm probably using those phrases incorrectly because I don't know, but somebody who's maybe deep, somebody who's maybe studying in the Vatican or something like that, they might be in that intersection point, but most people aren't. They could be quite spiritual but have no particular allegiance to any one faith, or you can have somebody who's very religious but maybe doesn't necessarily interrogate the ideas behind the beliefs, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
and I don't
absolutely.
mean that in a judgmental way.
No,
That's not meant
no.
in any way. And then you can have somebody who's a theologian who is interested in the science, theology of all of this, but may not necessarily have too deep a personal connection to any particular religion either. Would that be fair enough?
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assumption, or a very fair explanation of often how the three can divide as well at various points. So, theologians are often open to the accusation that we spend a bit too much time kind of going into the science of what we study. By that I mean the technicalities and the academic, the kind of detached academia of what we do, without exploring it, for example, in the lived experience of people. And maybe that's in many ways where spirituality enters the fray.
Yes.
Because for many, for a long period of time, when say Christianity was seen as kind of the default position of European life and culture, well, theology and spirituality were seen as pretty much interlinked and almost identical to one another. And one of the things that theology has often been accused of losing has been its spiritual, or almost its sense of praxis and place, and spirituality has emerged in its own place and time as an independent and autonomous area of study, because we're beginning to see so much more of what we have in the past associated with wisdom and religious and spiritual traditions in other walks of life as well, whether it be in the business world, whether it be in tourism and hospitality studies, whether it be the emergence of, for example, pilgrimage in different settings, or indeed the emergence of religious and spiritual ideas in cinema and the arts and places like that. And so in a way, the quest for integration and the quest to bring these areas, I suppose, into closer contact with each other after a period of detachment, is part of the study of spirituality as well. But also, it's important to recognise that people simply do not approach these areas and elements of life from one direction anymore, and that's the crucial element, I think, in what it means to explore and to study spirituality in a setting such as this. We're not behind the walls of a seminary. We're not in a religious institution. We're in a broad-based humanities department in an ostensibly secular institution. And so the question is, what do these ideas and practices and traditions have to say in that setting as well?
Yes.
And in a way, the broadness of that allows us to probably explore this with a different style of creativity, but also of interaction and interdisciplinarity as well. Of exploring the connections in the fullest sense between spirituality and other walks of life, and other areas that are explored in the humanities as well, and across the sciences.
Yeah, even into science, because my own background is maths and biology. So that's why I'm particularly interested in the development, say, of neurospirituality, and a lot of what I read is in medicine, because there is fantastic skills within the scientific community to actually deeply analyse and interrogate what happens in meditative states, in spiritual practices like pilgrimage or journaling, whatever the practice may be. So I think this is the advantage that WIT has as a setting for the study of spirituality, this interdisciplinary element that Paul was talking about, that we have a community of scholars here, all of which together have key skills, insights and research approaches that can enrich the study of spirituality, that if it was only in a kind of philosophical, theological community, it couldn't happen in the same way, like the School of Tourism here and the development of pilgrimage studies, the tourism exploration of motivation in tourism today, changes in the tourism market, and all of that can feed into our deeper reflection on where pilgrimage is going to go beyond here. So it's not simply a biblical idea of travelling that's going to feed pilgrimage ideas into the future. We have to look at marketing, environmental impact, and all of these kind of questions that tourism will be expert in order to look at pilgrimage. So this afternoon I'm going over to Wexford to meet the new pilgrimage officer there, because WIT has a PhD, funded PhD in pilgrimage studies, and that's not something abstract, that's something on the ground, and we're trying to look at the development of a new route between Wexford and Wales, and people are becoming more local in their pilgrimage interests because of the impact of COVID, because of the impact of war. So these new local routes are going to be a big dimension of pilgrimage into the future. So it's not just the spiritual, the small, narrow spiritual dimension that's feeding pilgrimage development. It's actually, global politics, the environment, and all of these realities as well are coming to bear on the development of pilgrimage as a key spiritual practice after COVID. This is what we're finding.
Would it be would it be fair to say, Bernadette, that you're actually engaged in applied spirituality?
Yeah, that's a brilliant word.
Would that be?
Yeah, so 20 years ago when we were designing this MA in spirituality, I had come up through a very classical route. I had done a classical MA in spirituality, which has meant that I had studied written texts from East and West, and I needed theological language in order to understand these written texts, because often that's the kind of language that was used to create the text. But then I came out of the world of education, and my friends were saying to me, well, what use is this to us, kind of thing? We're teaching 13 to 18 year olds and they don't have any of that language, kind of thing. Or what use is it for me as an educator? And then my maths community is so very involved in maths teaching, development of maths education for women in particular. So all of these were saying, what's that got to do with us? So that's what brought me on the route of saying, well, what has spirituality to say or to offer to the professions? And when that MA programme was developed, spirituality in the professions, that's the title we chose in the end, applied spirituality. So that's WIT has that MA in applied spirituality, and it fills up so fast every year. It's the interest in it is just amazing.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can imagine it gets to explore so many interesting ideas. You're both involved with the SpirSoP research group here at WIT. Bernadette, could you explain what the SpirSoP group is?
Yeah, so it's one of 4 research groups in the humanities, and as you said yourself there, Rob, it's very much in the applied area. So it's engaging with professionals, looking at what spirituality has to offer, what they're looking for from spirituality. So, for example, engaging with the nursing school. COVID has raised, questions.
Sorry, can I stop you there before you go? What does SpirSoP stand for?
It stands for Spirituality in Society and the Professions.
Okay, now I get where you're coming from. Okay,
yeah,
sorry to interrupt your flow.
No, not at all. So you could see then why we would be engaging with the nursing school, because healthcare workers found themselves at the front line of the COVID crisis and had to deal with dimensions of life that normally you'd be able to call in a chaplain or somebody for, and you were left handling these crises. Am I going to die? And the end of life and the life review, or what is next beyond this point, and I'm frightened, this is a scary place to be, and accompanying person through the dying stages isn't often something that a healthcare person has to do on their own. So the whole need for everybody to have basic spiritual care skills has arisen out of the COVID crisis. So this would be one dimension of spirituality in the professions, in the healthcare professions. And the next one of the brown bag talks now in May is going to be a leader in Europe, Tove Giske, speaking to us here in Waterford about what has been learnt about offering spiritual care and about the basic training in spiritual care that every person in frontline healthcare will need, not just for pandemics, for war, for trauma, for the various dimensions of life that you meet on the front line in healthcare. So the nursing healthcare professionals will be a typical profession that spirituality would be engaging with today.
So does spirituality, again, to bring it back to maybe something applied, would it have a lot to teach us about empathy for managers?
Yes.
If you know what I mean. Like,
they're the kind of skills, compassion, empathy, attentiveness, attunement. They're the kind of skills that at a practical level that spirituality would be cultivating and offering a step-by-step training approach for.
Okay. Okay. So again, I can see it's very applied. I mean, there are some very, very big ideas in the background there, obviously, but it is very applied, and you're trying to put it down to a kind of a human level, or person to person level, perhaps. Yeah. Or even in a business context, if you're talking about pilgrimage. I mean, half the world seem to do the Camino over in Spain there, right. Whereas I know there's a lot of wonderful walks and pilgrimage walks here in Ireland that haven't necessarily been I hate to say the word exploited, because I don't mean that, but haven't maybe been as publicised as
people haven't had the confidence in their own culture. I mean, because when you look at how the Camino was developed, it was one local person who actually looked around and said, look, this is such an economically challenged area. Do we have anything we can offer? And he said, well, there's this ancient walking route. So he spent his weekends or his evenings designing these little wooden signs that we see on the Camino with the shell on them, and he'd have 40 or 50 of them done. Maybe after a fortnight he'd head out in the car and he stuck them along the old walking route. That's how it developed. Like back in the 70s, you're looking at, maybe 40, 50, 100 people walking the Camino in a year. Now we're up at 300,000. So it wasn't just kind of commercial exploitation. It was a local person having confidence in what they had to offer. So I think it's got to do with reclaiming our heritage, becoming more confident in this Celtic heritage that we have is of enormous attraction around the world. It's seen as a heritage that knew how to practice hospitality. Herb gardens, healing was extremely strong. Beekeeping was very strong. So microagriculture, all of these kind of skills were part of that monastic Celtic heritage that we have. So what can we do to reactivate that for these times that are more ecologically aware? So it was a very ecologically aware way of life. So we see that it has a lot to offer to us as people for our well-being, for our sustainability. So it's trying to say, look, this heritage that we have has a lot to speak into the kind of challenges that we have today. Let's reactivate it. So this is what I'm on this afternoon now, the reactivation of a route between Wales and Ferns in Wexford, which would have some of these kind of elements. Particularly beekeeping was a big practice that was shared between these two sites. So this isn't all up in the air, airy, fairy, far away stuff. It deals with contemporary issues like, we're going to be challenged with hospitality now with all the Ukrainians that will be arriving in Ireland, and ecological challenges, climate challenges. These traditions that we have speak into that, but maybe we weren't looking at them because we didn't have the challenges around us that we have at this time.
When I invoke that, I didn't mean to imply a sense of kind of crass commercialism or anything like that, although we're probably going to come on to that when I talk to Paul later on about one of his recent publications. But again, an example of that would be the Greenway in Waterford.
Exactly.
Now, I don't necessarily know if there's a spiritual aspect of that, but that's an area that I've driven up and down that 100 million times in my life. But being on the bike, or walking it sometimes and being with children, and you see this wonderful natural world that's around you from a slightly different context, and you appreciate it more. And okay, it does have a knock-on business effects. I mean, the town of Kilmacthomas has been transformed essentially by the Greenway and certain parts of Dungarvan, and I know there's going to develop it further along the way, and I've seen it in Mayo as well with the Greenway up there. So I can understand that, yes, there is a commercial aspect to it, but that is only a byproduct of a larger thing. Yeah. Okay, right, I get you. Right, I was looking on your webpage, the SpirSoP webpage, on the WAT site, and you have a couple of themes identified, and I'd like to talk to you about two of them in particular. So we'll go to the first one, because the second one I know, Paul, you're going to talk about, and I want to get into that with you because I find it very fascinating. But Bernadette, I want to ask you this one first, because this is, I suspect, very tied up with the applied spirituality, as you were discussing earlier. Exploring spirituality programs which transform an addiction journey. Now, what does that mean?
Well, actually, we just have a publication ready to come out on this now, where we've gathered some articles from around the world. It's, we're all very much aware of something like the 12-step program.
Yes.
So, and we're all maybe aware of friends that have gone to Buddhist monasteries in Thailand or Vietnam as part of addiction recovery. Yeah. So, addiction is a biological phenomenon. The body systems begin to respond to stress in a particular way and need substances in order to be able to manage life stresses. There are ways of engaging the body systems beyond bringing substances into the body, but often we haven't learned those skills in terms of mindfulness, meditation, whatever it might be. So the people want to learn these skills of using the capacities that we have at a biological level for refocusing, de-stressing, living life in flow, that are there, and that meditation systems have skills and the scientific backup behind them to show that these are effective. So that's what we're looking at in different parts of the world. In Japan they do it one way, in Vietnam they do it a different way. We have the 12-step program maybe in this part of the world. So we're looking at, what's the latest science behind these programs? How have these programs evolved in the light of maybe a move from religion to being people defining themselves, I'm spiritual but not religious. So are these programs still effective in that context? That's what we're looking at. And the evidence is there that they are more, maybe even more recognised than before. And now that we can travel and meet spiritual interventions for addiction in different world religious contexts, we've become maybe more appreciative of what we knew already within our own context. So that's what we're looking at there. So
would you talk about this, for example, I'm going to bring it back to something I've direct experience with, and also is maybe tied up a little bit more in my own kind of wheelhouse, which is the likes of meditation apps. So, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with Headspace.
No, Calm is the one I know.
Okay, but there's a number of Headspace is one just that I've used. So it's an app on your phone. And there can be a meditation that it could be 10 minutes, 20 minutes. It depends on the context of what it is that you wish to do. Would that be an example of something that could be tied up in your research about spirituality programs transforming an addiction journey?
Yes. Okay. Yes. So, when I went back to my hairdresser after lockdown, we were talking about how did you get through it? And she said, I listened to Tara Brach every night on an app. Tara Brach has a meditation app kind of thing. So here was, a regular, I'm from inner city Dublin, a regular inner city Dublin friend saying to me, Tara Brach, Buddhist informed meditation teacher was what helped me sleep every night kind of thing. So the global impact and the fact that we can download these, and doesn't matter what part of the world they come from, from we can connect in, and there's, the power of influencers. So, Meghan Markle loses Tara Brach or whatever, and that gets the word out there. Yeah. So, I think we have to link it into the digital industry as well, and that has had an absolutely powerful impact in terms of disseminating these skills, these ancient skills of meditation, mindfulness, attentiveness, awareness, to a much more wide community. And so people have them available in their pocket, whereas before you had to be able to make your way to Clogher or wherever it might have been in the past to go on that kind of journey of a detachment from the cycles that we had got into, and to try and return to the core of our being, to our centre of place.
So these are ancient techniques. This is not something that somebody developed 4 years ago on an app. These are ancient techniques, and is perhaps spirituality about, before they would have been tied up with specific religious practices, wherever they may be, from whatever part of the world. Is spirituality about maybe separating that psychic, biohuman aspect of it from the religious part of it, and making it available to a non-religious audience? I would consider myself non-religious, but probably spiritual, if you know what I mean. Would that?
Yeah, there's a strong element of that in it, but I suppose there are, say, Buddhist organisations or Christian organisations that would highlight that, it's just like if you think about growing a hydrangea or whatever it is, if you only focus on feeding it one compound to make it grow, it can get out of shape and won't last very long. So you have to, so we can focus on one dimension of this is the practice, but the practice was often, embedded with eating habits, dietary habits, sleeping habits, social practices, compassion, sharing with the poor. So to cut off the meditation practice from its surrounding set of practices wouldn't make it very wholesome in the long term. So there is more connection between the communities that originated these practices, like, say, centering prayer within Christianity or mindfulness within Buddhism, and trying to say, well, what are the surrounding, or yoga, it would be very strong as well. What are the surrounding practices, like that kind of thing that we associate with yoga, of taking a particular physical position, is only one aspect within yoga. There are many other dimensions of what makes a full yoga practice. So I think that's been recognised now, that isolating the meditation piece from the surrounding social, health, well-being, community-oriented dimensions isn't experiencing the practice in its full richness.
So it's one part of a holistic whole.
Yeah.
Okay, I get what you. Paul, you were nodding away while Bernadette was speaking there. Is this something that chimes with you, or something that you have experienced?
Well, I'm just thinking that, in the post-COVID experience, everybody's talking about things like the Great Resignation and the different ways, the different paces of life that they discovered during lockdown. And one of the things that I think one of the things that has come from all of that is that maybe prior to COVID, and maybe in the last century or more, we've tended to treat the inner world as kind of an add-on to life. So even from a professional perspective, from a healthcare perspective, the spirit, what we would call the spiritual world, in all its complexity and in all its diversity, is something that's kind of ignored maybe when we tend to think of life maybe more like a machine, and therefore the inner world tends to be excluded from that. And I think maybe what we're trying to do with both the masters and with the research culture as well is to look to that inner world and restore its place as a place that we reflect upon, but also in a very practical sense in terms of the services for which we train and prepare students, the wider society that we engage with, be it in industry, be it in the wider civic culture, that these the spiritual and holistic care of people is an integral part of that, whether you're in HR, whether you're in business, whether you're in any aspect of the corporate world, or indeed if you're in a religious community as well, who may have lost sight of the richness and integrity of those different sources. Because, as Bernadette mentioned, you can't really understand yoga, you can't really understand the centering prayer within Christianity or any practice without a social and communal context. Kind of taken out of that, it becomes kind of again, it's treated a little bit like a machine. Yeah. And whereas what people, I think, discovered during lockdown was a whole range of new practices to integrate into their life. So the real kind of strength of apps and podcasts is that they're integral. They're part of our lives. We're not, and in a lockdown situation, that's all you're left with. You need things, you can't go anywhere. So you need things to embed into your practice, into your day. And I think all of these practices have to be understood against, the backdrop of a life world, a place where it happens. And that'll be different for every person, and that has to be recognised in its integrity too. And the other interesting point that you mentioned there was that, that growing distinction between, in a sense, you might not be a religious person, but you can go on the greenway and appreciate the connection to nature that offers. It's not necessarily, although we might yet discover through archaeological research that one day that was an ancient path treaded by someone or some people. But the point being is that that sense of connection in that inner world is, in a sense, something that's always there, and it's a recognition, partly what we do is we're recognizing that in the culture around us, that appreciation is just happening in a multitude of different ways. It's not confined to institutional religion as we once knew it. It's not necessarily confined to any particular tradition of theology or of wisdom. And there are just new places where this is opening up. And I think it's important to be attentive to those places. Because if we lose it, then, or if we miss it, then there's something unnamed and perhaps uncultivated as well in people's lives.
Bernadette, you mentioned that you have a paper due to be published soon about this topic. Well, can you remember what? Do you know
on
what
the
that's
addiction
called?
and
Yes.
spirituality? Yeah, it's a collection of papers. It's coming out in a book. The book series is called Religions. And then it's just the subtitle Spirituality and Addiction. So this book called Religions takes different contemporary themes, particularly spirituality. It has about 30 books on spirituality coming out this year, all in applied dimensions. Okay. And so this one from WIT, Noelia Molina, who's the director of the MA, and myself are bringing out one on spirituality and addictions and what's happening in that world. So a number of people from WIT who teach on the MA programme are actually in the book. So one of the works is links with the arts. It's people who, through their addiction journey, have been trying to look at sacred texts, the Quran or the Bible, and in order to kind of take hold of what that might say into this struggle that I have, they've begun to do artistic work, like we saw in the manuscripts, the Book of Kells and those kind of books in the past. We know that, drawing the text, annotating, illuminating the text often gave people a way of pondering and taking hold of and letting what was in the text be transformative in a daily life way. So Dr. Amanda Dillon, who's a postdoctoral researcher here, is working on these illuminations that have happened of spiritual texts with people who struggle with various issues in life.
And when will this book be available?
Okay. we just wrote to the editor at the weekend and say, well, where is it now? Has it got lost in the machine? So by May, hopefully it'll be out.
Okay, hopefully by the end of the academic year.
Oh yeah, that's the aim.
And when it is, I'm sure there'll be references to it up on the SpirSoP webpage as well. So it'll be up there as well. Yeah. Paul, I'd like to talk to you briefly about a paper that you wrote recently, the Cinema of Contemplation. And it was tied up with a movie called First Reformed, which I watched last night. I've been meaning to watch this film for years, right? Bernadette, have you seen this movie?
I haven't seen this movie, no.
Okay, so I've been meaning to watch this for years. It's directed by Paul Schrader. It stars Ethan Hawke as a priest who is suffering from, I suppose, a crisis of faith and a crisis of conscience and a crisis of commercialism as well, arguably. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to play a brief excerpt from the movie, and then we might talk about your paper. Is that okay?
Yeah.
I've decided to keep a journal, to set down all my thoughts and the simple events of my day. I will keep this diary for 1 year, and at the end of that time, it will be destroyed.
I encouraged my son to enlist. It was a family tradition. 6 months later, he was dead in Iraq. I was lost. My son's the reading of the Lord. Praise be God.
So how are you?
Oh, I'm fine.
No, really. It's been a while since we've talked. Even a pastor needs a pastor.
Did you see the doctor?
You need someone to take care of you. I want you to be happy.
I know that nothing can change, and I know there is no hope.
So as you can hear, there's obviously a lot of, I suppose, there's a lot of religious sounds in there. You have the organ, you have the priest with the crisis of conscience. Funny, he's not a Catholic priest. He's a Calvinist reverend, isn't that
Dutch
correct?
Calvinist, yeah.
Yeah, Dutch Calvinist. Okay, so funny, right? So it's written and directed by Paul Schrader, who's a very famous screenwriter, wrote Taxi Driver, did a lot of work with Martin Scorsese.
Yeah.
On the surface of it, look, it's about religion, it's about churches, but you wrote a very insightful paper that I read last night, by the way, and I don't fully understand because I don't fully understand the movie. There's a lot to take in from it. Yeah. What can we learn about contemplation from a movie like that?
The contemplation idea was one. I'm sorry, if I was a strict film theorist would say I'm cheating, because I took it from an interview that Ethan Hawke gave about the movie afterwards. So I'm cheating just a tad because it's from.
Why are you cheating? Because you're taking it in.
I'm taking it from something outside of the movie, from somebody's views about it in the aftermath. So maybe in film theory we'd say we're cheating just a tad. But he gave a very interesting interview. I think it was to Stephen Colbert in the US. On the aftermath of the film's release, about the whole idea of good cinema being something that reverberates, that a film should almost go off in your head and stay going off long after it's concluded. And that's what makes interesting, significant, and you might say too spiritual cinema, that it continues long after the movie has ended. And you know, some would say that, well, not all cinema lends itself to, I'm thinking, Jackass the movie or something like that won't necessarily lend itself to that definition. But
maybe it will. Maybe you're being
so.
Unfair.
Yeah, let's not set the perimeters too high. But his idea and the idea behind the piece which I wrote in Reality, which is a Redemptorist magazine, on all sorts of matters between culture and religion and spirituality, was that maybe this gives us an example of what contemplative or spiritual cinema might look like, because it's not just about the themes or the characters that are developed within it, but also the way the movie itself works as a kind of puzzle that you've got to piece together, that you're involved in, and that without giving the ending away, you're not too sure how it works out. You're still thinking about its ending long afterwards. And so in that sense, I think because it's both open-ended a little, without spoiling it, and it is something that uses, I suppose, deeply significant themes, not just about Christianity per se, but equally about the environmental crisis and humanity's place in its home, and equally about the interface between politics and religion, and the cynicism that breeds, but also the despair that breeds. That those two things, what they might call like the intra and extra diegetic, which is kind of the inner world of the film and its themes and its characters and its stories, plus the way the film is put together and the type of experience it kind of elicits, just as a formal thing, is when you watch it, what it's doing. Those things put together kind of make it a very contemplative piece, because you literally have to work with it, you have to grapple with it, you nearly have to struggle with it, and in that way, it represents a project that was long in the mind of Paul Schrader as well, but equally it resembles a lot of earlier types of stories in cinema as well. There's Robert Bresson's movie from the 50s or 60s, Diary of a Country Priest, which was a similar idea, based on a French novel that followed a Catholic priest's kind of crisis of conscience and of faith and of experience. And these stories are kind of not just about particular figures or characters or things, but they're also significant because they're emblematic of something within human experience more generally. So I know it's a heavy. We're recording this midweek, so it's a heavy thing it's a heavy watch on a Monday or Tuesday evening.
Oh yeah, but interesting what you said about it reverberates, because I woke up this morning thinking about the film. Like it was there. I went to bed last night thinking about the film, obviously, but I woke up this morning thinking about it. And funny enough, it wasn't so much the ending. Maybe some of the imagery from the ending, but which I won't get into, because if somebody wants to watch it, it's certainly worth watching. It's First Reformed by Paul Schrader, starring Ethan Hawke and a whole variety of different people. But it was the thing that struck me was there's this conflict, arguably, between the First Reformed Church, which is this small, old historical church. It's celebrating its 250th anniversary in somewhere in upstate New York or downstate New York, I can't remember where exactly, versus the mega church that essentially owns it, that is so much tied up with commercialism and big numbers and, you know, the big kind of rock band choir, as opposed to something that's much more traditional and contemplative, perhaps, in the old church. And that was the conflict that arises between those. But then there's some fairly heady themes about loss and family loss and addiction. And interesting enough, like the whole framing of the journal, which now that Bernadette has been talking about journaling as a kind of meditative practice, or a practice to go inside yourself.
It's a massive theme. Like he is Ethan Hawke's character is a priest in the, just to give the premise, who is, living on his own in this very austere church that was once a part of the Civil War history, because it was part of the Underground Railroad that, evacuated slaves out of the South. And so it has this history of social justice, as well, and a gravitas to it. But it's got a declining congregation. He himself is no longer convinced of his vocation, so he journals by night. But he's also in the grip of, a serious addiction with drink. He's suffering from the onset of a serious illness. He's still grieving the loss of a son who died in the Iraq War, and he himself was a military chaplain and encouraged the son to enlist. And then, one of his parishioners comes to him with a very serious existential question, that's enveloping her family. But the journaling question is very interesting because, he journals through his illness, through his addiction. And he resolves at the start of the film, to write down everything, which is a similar theme. And very interestingly, then you have the contrast with, Cedric the Entertainer plays the mega church pastor who kind of owns this, and it's treated very much like a business. And even at one point remonstrates with them. He says, "You're reading that Thomas Merton guy." I mean, he didn't know anything about the real world either, And he says, even at one point, "You're always in the garden. Even Jesus wasn't always in the garden," So there's this kind of more transactional approach to religion that's equally intertwined with politics as well, because, another subtext of it is the environmental crisis and the interface between the mega church and its political donors who, aren't happy with references to, to the climate crisis in Hawke's own spirituality, or in Ernst Toller's, the character's name, own spirituality. So in all of those things, you've got a lot of, and the movie works like a kind of journal through those questions then. And an emblematic journal as well, in the sense that the way that Schrader uses cinema and the experiment he's been working on a lot of his adult life is, how does cinema not just depict certain things, but equally, how does it function itself or operate as a site of, spiritual questioning, of thinking, of participation? More so than just, observing stuff, because a lot of the time the religion kind of cinema stuff can get bogged down in the, the Jesus epics or the sword and sandal epics, the representation of the spectacle of religion without the interrogative journey that, might be more more interesting to be a part of, and certainly more demanding in a sense as an experience.
Yeah, it's one of those films actually that I wish I'd seen it in the cinema.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that with no disrespect, because I watched it at home and look, I enjoyed it, but I did stop it halfway and went out and made a cup of tea and came back in and had a cup of tea and I had a biscuit as well. Whereas, you know, when you're in the cinema, when you see a film like that, it is kind of relentless. Yeah. There's a lot of heady conversations with people sitting in rooms, like not necessarily like this one, but
even smaller.
Even smaller, yeah. It's very claustrophobic. Yeah. And then there's actually a wonderful kind of almost dream sequence that comes into it. And that's quite impactful because it's so at odds with everything else that you've seen so far.
Yes, yeah.
But anyway, look, it's a fascinating film. I'm very glad I watched it and you were the catalyst for me watching that. And I would recommend you check out Paul's paper after you've watched the film and maybe had time to digest it, have a read of it. All of your material, you have references to everything up on the website. So if somebody wanted to find out about you and about the SpirSoP group and the material that you're producing, what's the best place to go? wit.ie/SpirSoP. So we've tried to put the material together there. We have a few videos there as well from talks we've given. So we're building the site over time. So we have another meeting coming up in May. So we may have something coming from that. So. Great. Right, final question for you. And this is not necessarily tied to spirituality, although it can be. If I could ask you for a bit of advice for any aspiring researcher or somebody who is maybe thinking about getting into research, what would it be? So Bernadette, maybe we'll go to yourself first. Yeah, well, I look after the research in the MA in applied spirituality, and I've done that for 20 years, and no two students have ever come up with the same research topic. So I always say, follow your best insight. I have an exercise that I do before we choose our kind of research themes, which is, it's not really what you want to do in the research, it's what research is calling you to do, kind of thing. So there's been a question that's been around inside you for a long time, or you watched a film, you picked up a book, you had a conversation with somebody, you had an experience, and you really want to explore that more. It's there with you when you get up in the morning. You find if you're drinking a cup of coffee, it comes back to you, that kind of thing. What is it that seems to just be asking for your attention? And let that be the theme that you would explore in your spirituality research then. Yeah, but you could probably apply that to any research. You probably could, exactly. Whether it's mathematical or computing or whatever. We give people permission to explore the unexplored, these kind of states of consciousness and dimensions of human life that often get neglected. You may be the first person that will research the topic that you're researching, and that's but you're part of an onward movement of research that's happening today. So that's the kind of way I would encourage people. Don't worry if you're the first. There will be more who will be going on this path, because the evidence of the last 20 years is if you put in spirituality and architecture or spirituality and addiction on a Google search, just watch, it's an upward line for all these areas. So you're on a path that's developing. Amazing. Paul, the same question to you. If you could give a piece of advice to somebody who is maybe at the start of their research journey, what would it be? Don't be afraid of either your mistakes or your incompleteness, because every research project is explored through the bits you get wrong and through the bits you don't quite get right, because that's the learning process. And in a world that maybe seeks perfection and completeness all the time, it's important to be aware actually that in our research we're contributing to something that's evolving all the time. And that the journey from level 9 to level 10, for example, and beyond is a journey into something that's experimental in every sense of the word, in the scientific, in the theoretical, in the philosophical sense of the word. Don't be afraid of either of those aspects, because to fear those is the thing that stops us exploring both our ideas and our passions. Wonderful. Well, to Paul Clogher and Bernadette Flanagan, thank you so much for speaking with me today in the 9 Plus podcast. I genuinely feel like it's been educational. So I do appreciate your time. And if you want to find out more about the group that they're involved in and the research that they're producing, wit.ie/SpirSoP, SpirSoP. And there's lots of material there for you to kind of dig your teeth into. Folks, thank you very, very much. Pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for listening to the 9 Plus podcast. You can keep up to date on Twitter at 9 Plus Podcast, and we'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, good luck.